Hello everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we will talk about the struggle of light and darkness in the context of images created in ancient times. The oldest images, we may argue, that we are able to look at today. We'll talk about cave art and how in cave art the hero's journey was depicted in its most sort of primitive, most original, most strapped down form. Now, what I mean by that is we'll look at images that are devoid of the influence of consciousness, as Jung would say, depicting the struggle that the hero went through in its interaction with the environment, its encounter with the unknown, its fight with darkness, its battle to survive. We'll look at, in essence, the battle of consciousness with the unconscious in a time where the unconscious was still threatening to overwhelm consciousness entirely. Now, if you are new to these topics entirely, then let me briefly introduce the channel and let me briefly introduce also what we do in the videos that we share and the sort of point of argument that we come from. On the channel, we mostly talk about Carl Jung. We mostly talk about psychology, neuroscience, and topics surrounding those fields. And we're particularly interested in the interaction of the subject with the environment and the process of meaning creation in this interaction. Now, to achieve that, or to, let's say, to paint a picture of meaning and the interaction with the subject and the environment, Jung has essentially prompted us to look at or to analyze what he referred to as products of the psyche. Products of the psyche for Jung were those images or products, literally the artifacts that we as humans create in the interaction with the environment. Now, this environment for Jung included also the internal interactions that we had with ourselves, since for Jung, the difference between the sort of environment proper, so whatever is outside and whatever is inside in me, those lines were blurred for him. He was convinced that within ourselves was a world underlying the personal layers of the psyche that is also present outside, underlying the layers of the physical world that we encounter in the external environment. And this layer he referred to as the collective unconscious, the realm, perhaps you've heard that, the realm in which the archetypes are situated. Now, the archetypes are, as we've outlined in many videos, and so I won't go in detail on that, but the archetypes are essentially those trajectories that give structure to this realm of the collective unconscious, to this realm that's underlying both the psychic and the physical reality. Now, because there is this intersection between the psychic and the physical reality, we can look at images from the psyche, right, that we created psychologically and deduce certain, let's say, eternal forms, eternal struggles that also pertain to the environment from them. Now, I want to be very clear here. It doesn't necessarily, this line of argument doesn't necessarily lead to a metaphysical claim of an actual underlying reality, sort of like the eternal forms in Plato, or a transcendental reality in religions, right? It doesn't necessarily claim that. What Jung instead claims, and this is always a good entry point into his arguments, is essentially an evolutionary argument, a quasi-evolutionary argument, if you will. Essentially what he's saying is humans have always been in interaction with the environment that we exist in, right? That we know. We've always somehow interacted with the environment, with an environment, let's say. Now, while this environment has changed, certain axioms of this interaction have remained the same. Those axioms, or those structures, those patterns of sameness, let's say, are relatively stable over time, and they therefore shape relatively stable actions or responses on the level of the subject over time. That is why relatively stable patterns of behavior have arisen or emerged within sort of the psychological reality of the subjects, within our psychological reality. Now, that's why we can say, even though we've, thousands of years have passed since, let's say, images from cave art have been created, we still nonetheless can deduce from them sort of these eternal forms that we now still struggle with today. We can deduce from them essentially an echo of a reality that that still penetrates the everyday lives that we exist in, the everyday struggles that we go through, and therefore can still be you may say a lesson or something of wisdom that we may look at in order to gather information, how to move forward, or how to conduct ourselves in the world. Now, to be very precise here in this introduction, I'm not going to look at the cave art that we're going to look at in historical preciseness. So I'm not going to say, well, this image has been created in Siberia or Scandinavia. We could do that, but again, from a Jungian standpoint, that wouldn't make a lot of sense, simply because it doesn't really matter where the image has been created. The context, these eternal fundamental forms, right? If we speak again with Plato, these archetypal patterns, they remain the same no matter where, sort of in what context we interact with the environment in, because the patterns are essentially they're eternal, and they're recurring in the sense that they're recurring temporally and spatially, right? Also, I'm not a historian, it's quite simple. It's not my area of expertise. Now, the way we'll look at this, again, is in the context of the hero's journey. So perhaps a few notes on the hero's journey before we begin are in order. Again, as I said, I did make some videos on this already, so do go and check them out. But just to recap, the hero's journey essentially captures, or as a description, as we put it today, the struggle of consciousness with the unconscious. Now, you probably wouldn't think that if you've read about the hero's journey elsewhere, if you looked at, let's say Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, what you see on the surface level is a lot of interactions of some hero figure with something that he struggles with. It's usually male. He struggles with, and then coming, something emerges out of that struggle. The typical sort of, let's say, the typical cycle of the hero, the cycle of the self, if you will, in that we see, right? The descent and the ascent. But essentially what's behind this manifestation, right, or these multiple manifestations, is the struggle of consciousness with the unconscious. Now, to understand that, let's look at the story that Jung tells us of consciousness and the unconscious and their sort of eternal dance or eternal interaction. The story essentially that Jung presents us with is one where in the beginning there was darkness and chaos, right? As you see, this is by the way, this is obviously not a story that Jung tells us. It's a story that Jung deduced from many, many sources, and it's probably one of the oldest stories of humankind, right? But, essentially at the beginning of time, there is darkness, right? There is chaos and darkness, the tohu vavohu that we find in the Bible, the sort of the blackness that we find in the water that we find in the Egyptian creation myth of the Nile. Whatever it is, you can look at many creation myths in this context if you want, and perhaps I'll upload a video on creation myths once in the future. But essentially that's the origin, that's the starting point. And from this starting point on, essentially what happens is consciousness attempts to differentiate itself from this sort of bed that it is embedded in, from this you may say, from the womb that it has been breeding and it has been growing in. The seed of consciousness is there, but the land, sort of the physical land, has to emerge out of this darkness of the ocean. It has to break through the surface and then emerge. And what's important for Jung is that this process is not a one-time thing, right? It's not consciousness emerges and creation is done. No, it's an eternal struggle. Consciousness always struggles to differentiate because, on the other hand, the unconscious always attempts to overwhelm consciousness again. And you see this essentially in your own life, right? You see that whenever you try to make an effort to do something, right, to do anything that requires will, if you will, that requires effort, right, then you always have a tendency in you to simply say, oh well, not today, or oh well, I don't need to do that really. I'd rather just lay down and hang out, or whatever it is, right? And that essentially is the struggle, I would argue, between sort of the return to the womb and the emergence out of the depths of the ocean into something oneself is. Now, is that the meaning of life, right? To just struggle against the darkness that one has emerged from? No, definitely not. For Jung, it is instead, the meaning is instead to find a relationship between this darkness and the light that one has created in consciousness. And the precise attempt to create this relationship, to get into this dialogue, to be engaged in this dialogue over time, and to remain engaged in this dialogue for eternity, is the let's say, the essence of the hero's journey. And it is a dangerous quest, this engagement, right? Because this is essentially the engagement of the hunter with its prey. It's the movement it's the movement outside of the realm of the campfire into the darkness of the forest, right? It's this decision to sojourn into a strange land, to be voluntarily become a stranger in a strange land, to voluntarily move against the desire for safety, to voluntarily submit yourself to the darkness of the ocean, to descend into the ocean, encounter the monster, and then return, right? This is all, for Jung, the hero's journey is essentially based on a voluntary process, a voluntary submission to the forces of the darkness and the unknown. Now, what is very important is obviously that there is also an involuntary aspect to this, but we'll have to talk about this in another video, and I've hinted at this in other videos, because the unconscious can't be ignored. It enforces itself essentially over time, right? Now, why do I say unconscious and essentially equated to the unknown, right? That's of course we have to look at that. It's a bit of a controversy, perhaps. Now, one reason why I do this is because I think it makes things easier to understand. But essentially, especially if this is the first time you come across the unconscious, but for Jung, the unconscious, especially the personal unconscious, but then via its its link to the collective unconscious, is constantly projected outwardly. So for Jung, the reality that we encounter is endowed with the kinds of struggles that you have repressed and denied to admit, right? Like, you see them everywhere around you, right? You see that for instance, let's say you have a conversation with your partner or your parents, right? And in that conversation, something comes up that is uncomfortable, and you have the impulse to stop that conversation, to just go away and just ignore it, right? And that may be a valid impulse, right? Because there's a danger to the conversation. There's something threatening, perhaps threatening to the stability of the ego. As again, I've highlighted this in many other videos. You should go and watch them, perhaps, because it's a very important topic. The whole aspect that we talk about, the struggle between consciousness and the unconscious, is essentially the ego's struggle for stability. So if you want to really understand this, you'll have to look at the ego, right? You'll have to understand the ego, and so go back and watch some of the other videos, and I'll continue making videos on the ego and its struggle, the tyranny essentially of the ego, because I think it's so crucial to understand the entire psychology of Jung and to understand yourself ultimately. But let's go back and imagine you have this conversation, this fictional conversation that I'm sure happens to all of us, right? You can walk away, or you can stay in the conversation and face whatever it is that you have to face, right? And it's very easy to assume then that it's everything you say is your partner's or your parents or whoever's fault that you're conversing with. But instead, what Jung would argue, well, many of the things that you also criticize in the other tend to be projections. They tend to come from within you. They tend to be what you put on the other in order to sort of protect your own stability, your own integrity, your own coherence, essentially, the coherence of the narrative that you've created for yourself or about yourself, right? And so it is very valuable to engage in these conversations, right? And you see this as an engagement with the unconscious as much as the engagement with the natural environment on the level of the unknown. So the unknown natural environment may be an engagement with the unconscious. Now, this has multiple levels, right? On the one hand, you tend to see things in the dark that you're scared of, right? We all know that you're scared of monsters in the dark, right? Children don't like darkness. Starting at a certain age, they don't like darkness, and that's the age in which there's something that you can be scared of, right? There's nothing to be scared of, I think, if the ego hasn't emerged to some capacity, simply because nothing can be scared, right? The ego is scared, and it's scared, I think, always of its own destruction, right? And that includes the body's destruction, by the way, because the body is essentially the surface upon which the ego paints its own assumptions, right? And vice versa, right? The body paints a lot of assumptions into the ego, and it's the most fundamental experience at some degree that you have a stable, reliable body. And if that breaks down, essentially the ego breaks down in its structure, right? But now the point is that if you venture into the unknown, then you venture into literally the unconscious that you yourself have been building over time. Now, what is more important in the context of Kavard is that for Jung, consciousness does not only develop or emerge or get stronger or whatever you want to call it within the lifespan of an individual subject, but it gets stronger, it develops, it unfolds within the lifespan of society as a whole. So Jung would say that the consciousness of those people that created Kavard has been weaker than the consciousness that we today as modern human beings sort of inhabit. And that's why it's so interesting to look at Kavard in part, right? Because it has been, as Jung would put it, created at a time where consciousness was still sort of just emerging out of the darkness of the unconscious, right? And that's the time for Jung where the archetypes have been mostly created, which doesn't mean, by the way, that the archetypes are not still being created, but it simply means that there has been a process of creation that is somehow, let's say, more significant than the process of continuous creation that is still going on today. Now, with that, let us venture into some of these images that I brought today, and let us also, before we do that, let us quickly contextualize them a little further. So we're looking at images of hunters, right? So the times that I've chosen to show you the images from are times where we did not yet develop agriculture. We were hunters, so it was essentially a situation where people would venture out, as I just painted the picture for you, into an unknown space, encountering all kinds of dangers, and returning to their home with a sort of a reward, right? Essentially a kind of a treasure, if you will, right? And that's the fundamental hero's journey, right? The last step of the hero's journey is the sacrifice of the treasure, right? That is you give up the treasure to return it to your society. And I think, by the way, that's the point where the archetype is transformed. If we look at this as a struggle literally of consciousness and the unconscious, a struggle essentially that reflects the inability of the archetypal realm to renew itself. If you look at the answer to Job that Jung wrote, or for instance, why did God create man, and so on and so forth, to renew himself. That's essentially the struggle we see. But the images we'll be looking at now again are images from hunting society, right? From a society of peoples who hunted. And I want to point out a few things. So let me just pull up these images real quick. That was the wrong. Hold on. Okay, here. I hope you can see the images now, or the image that's one image for now. So what we see essentially in this image, right, is we see two anthropomorphic figures that they're from Spain, and we see that they're both, well, one of them is holding a weapon, so that's that's supposedly the hunter, and the other one sort of is more of an animal than this one, but they're both part animal, part human, right? And you somehow see, well, this could be a spear that is sort of pierces through this other anthropomorphic, zoomorphic being, or it could simply be an artistic intervention, right? We don't know that, but essentially what you see is that both of them have some zoomorphic, so some animal components, right? Their heads have horns, they're horned, right? And you see this often, by the way, also in shamanic rituals, when the shaman dresses somehow in the sort of the animal skin, right, attempting to literally become the animal, which is, it's a gesture in a way of, it's a gesture of the integration of the integration of that which is not you may say shadow integration, you may say an integration of the unknown, whatever you may call it, but it's essentially an integration of that which you're trying to go after, right? And I think that is quite interesting, right? You want to literally become that which you're attempting to kill, but it's I think there's more to it than killing, because again, like especially in hunting, you kill and you eat, right? You don't just kill for fun, which makes modern hunting in part very fun, very strange, right? Because you hunt and then what? You somewhat commercialize it, or even fishing is the most perverted example, where you fish and you simply put the fish back into the water. It's like, well, what kind of a perversion of the original gesture of hunting is that? Because the entire idea is you encounter a certain danger with certain tools that you have, in order to then integrate those dangers within you, literally by eating them. And that's, I think, a very important gesture, which is anticipated in their dress, right? What I want to point out here, this is the least pertinent image with this aspect, but you do see the sort of the pronounced phallic symbol here, and then you see this weapon also sort of resembling a phallic symbol, and we see this, we'll re-encounter this in many of the images that we'll look at, and I want to just sort of, the phallus is a symbol of it seems to be a symbol of the ego's sort of the strength of the ego in its battle against the unconscious, or in its battle against the forces that may break down the ego ultimately. And I see this especially in if you look at, well, I did some research into the reports of the National Socialist soldiers, their diaries and so on and so forth, before and during the war, but still in Weimar Republic, and then later in the war, and there you see a lot of the sort of you see this literal depiction, and you see this in the images and in the writing that they produced, the literal depiction of sort of this rock in the water, if you will, right? You see this strong rock, right, in the waves in the water, a lighthouse in the water, right? It's a literal metaphorical, if you will, depiction of of the beacon of consciousness, the beacon of hope in the sea of destruction, or whatever you will, right? And you see this often linked to the phallus as an image, not always literally, but definitely in a sense of in a metaphorical sense. And so I want to point out to you that if you look at images like these, for instance, you have a hunter here depicted, obviously a very successful hunter with a bow bigger than himself and a phallus almost as big as his legs. And so there you have again that image, that identification with this penis, with his phallus, which again I think depicts this or signifies this the aspect of the domination of one force over the other. And if you would now associate the phallus with the force of light, right, as you would in sort of the Jung proposed this, that you would associate the sort of the male force with light and the female force with darkness, right? You see this in the yin and yang symbol, by the way, yang being a depiction of the sunny side of a mountain, while yin is a depiction of the dark side, so this the shadow side of the mountain. And then if you look at the Chinese, the symbols, the characters, yang includes the sign for the sun, and yin includes the sign for the moon. And now we all know that the male is associated with Sol, so the sun, in alchemy, Sol, or Latin, and Luna is associated with the moon, right? And you have many associations, archetypally speaking, between the female, the feminine, and the moon, and vice, alia, and darkness, therefore, and light, and this and the phallic, or the male, right? And again, that's why I draw this sort of this line between the force of consciousness, the phallic, the light, and so on and so forth, venturing into here the sort of the unknown, the unconscious. And I want to highlight that to you, simply because it's a significant, it's an interesting fact, it's a significant observation. Let's look at some of these other images here. Here you see a group of dancing hunters who have obviously completed a successful hunt. Again, you have the phallic the phallus pronounced here. The same in this image. You have here some of these hunters here with pronounced phalli. Here. This is, I think, the image that we saw previously here. Here you see again a hunter with a very pronounced phallus, again with the mask of the animal, right? And let's go into this image. Right here you see the actual act of the hunting, the actual hunting act, which is sort of an act where you have the horned being, right, the horned cow being attacked by all of these pointy things. Again, you may draw a link to the phallic here. We don't have to overdo it with the phallus, but there is an apparent sort of association with this as well. This was from India, by the way, as the headline indicated. Here again, you have this the dance. You have sort of a dance on the way to hunting. You see again animal-like or zoomorph masks here a little bit. And here you have the literal image of sort of this is an anthropomorph being. Like, this is more of an animal than it would be a human, but it still has anthropomorphic characters. And again, you see the phallus highlighted, and you could say this is sort of the stage that you venture into, or that you become, that which you become when you successfully hunted, right? You become part animal, right? And this, I think this is so interesting, right? To sort of just as a concluding remark, I think when you tame the chaotic, right? When you go on and achieving the goal of the hunt, which is the taming of the chaotic in that sense, right? The movement into the unconscious, the success over it, right? The victory that you're looking for, right? What you become is that which you've hunted, right? And we know that, right? In common language, we say you become that which you pursue, right? And I will talk about this in another video, right? With the sort of, and that's why I also have this image pulled up here. Sort of, you become that which is the highest good, right? Which you think is the highest good for yourself, which you set as the highest value for yourself, right? You become that, and that devours you to some extent. It takes you in. And if you want it or not, right, that is essentially what you become, right? And we see this, I think, depicted nicely in these images, because on the one hand, yes, you'll be, the one with the most pronounced phallus, right? The one who has the tamer of the darkness, if you will, but you will also become the darkness. And I think we see this, for instance, nicely in Harry Potter. We see this in Spider-Man, I think, although I haven't really watched Spider-Man, at least not the new videos, the new movies. Haven't really watched those. But in the old Spider-Man, I if I remember correctly, Spider-Man becomes the dark Spider-Man, right? He's the red one, and then he's the black one at some point, and obviously that makes him evil, right? So you have a certain power, and you have that power because something happened. Spider-Man liked spiders, and so he got bitten by a spider. Was that accidental, or did that have something to do with his courage? Now, probably was an interaction, I don't know, but I don't know the video, the movie enough to judge that, but essentially that power, power corrupts, not in the sense that it corrupts literally, but in the sense that to be powerful, you need to be some level of darkness, and you need to continue venturing into the unknown and continue living with open eyes and moving into the sort of the darkness that you've once that the power that you have has once emerged from. I think that's you'll enter into a new fiduciary relationship with the darkness, right? That is essentially the core of the hero's journey. And I pointed this out, and those videos are, I think, very important. In the movement between the conscious and the unconscious realms is eternal. It's sort of the transcendental movement that is eternal, right? You always move up and down the world ladder. You can't stop, because if you stop, you'll again fall back into the tyranny of the ego, but now supercharged with the fact that you have some powers that set you apart from others. So, and that may corrupt you in a real way, right? Well, perhaps with those remarks, let's conclude the video, and thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting the channel. Please do consider to subscribe if you haven't done so yet. And again, as I pointed out, watch some of these other videos. I think they're important to understand what I've been trying to put forward in this little talk. And take care. Oh, also leave a comment if you want, and of course a like to boost the algorithm. But most importantly, leave a comment and let me know what you thought. Okay, bye bye.